The flight that almost wasn't. The private jet terminal was a sanctuary of silent luxury. Soft lighting bathed the polished marble floors, reflecting off the sleek, modern decor. The scent of freshly brewed espresso and fine leather lingered in the air as well-dressed executives and jet-set socialites moved with an effortless grace, their conversations hushed and controlled. It was a world of power, money, and exclusivity, one where Sophia Langston had more than earned her place. Yet, as she stepped inside, she felt the weight of unseen eyes assessing her, questioning her presence in this realm of privilege. Dressed in a navy blue tailored suit with a crisp white blouse, Sophia exuded quiet confidence. She carried a single leather carry-on and her tablet, no ostentatious designer labels, no exaggerated displays of wealth. She didn't need them. Her presence alone commanded attention. The young receptionist at the check-in desk smiled professionally as Sophia approached. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you?" "I'm here for the Langston flight to Geneva," Sophia responded, her voice measured, composed. The receptionist's fingers flew over the keyboard, and within seconds, her professional smile deepened. "Of course, Ms. Langston. Everything is in order. Your jet is being prepared, and the captain will meet you shortly." Sophia gave a small nod of acknowledgement, stepping aside. She should have been relaxed, excited even. This flight was more than just a trip. It was a pivotal moment for her company, Langston Lux, a luxury goods empire she had built from the ground up. The deal she was about to finalize in Geneva would secure her company's expansion into Europe, a market she had worked tirelessly to enter. Every detail had been meticulously arranged. Nothing could go wrong. Or so she thought. A miscalculation at 30,000 feet. Minutes later, a man in a pristine pilot's uniform approached. His posture was straight, his expression neutral. At first glance, a professional to his core. But as his sharp, assessing blue eyes swept over Sophia, something in his demeanor shifted. It was subtle, but she caught it. A flicker of hesitation, a slight tightening of his jaw. A calculation happening in real time. "Captain Todd Benson, ma'am." He introduced himself with a curt nod. His handshake was firm but dismissive, a brief clasp of fingers before he withdrew as if her touch might linger longer than he found comfortable. "Sophia Langston," she replied evenly, her gaze steady. "I assume everything is on schedule." Todd hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Yes, but are you sure you're on the right flight?" A slow blink. The air between them thickened, weighted by the connotation behind his words. Sophia's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond. But instead, she let the silence stretch. Let him hear the absurdity of his own question in the echo of his hesitation. "I'm quite sure," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. "Considering it's my jet." Todd blinked. "Your jet." There it was. The disbelief. "Yes," she said smoothly. "I own it." A beat of silence passed, then another. Sophia saw it all in his face, the flicker of doubt, the unconscious arch of his brow, the tightening of his lips. It wasn't just surprise. It was resistance. "Forgive me, Miss Langston," Todd said, his tone shifting into forced politeness. "It's just, we don't often see private jet owners such as yourself." Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Such as myself." Todd hesitated, clearing his throat. "Well, you know, typically our clientele are. Well, they come from certain backgrounds." Ah, there it was. A more delicate person might have let it slide. A less seasoned woman might have smiled politely and stepped past it. But Sophia Langston had not built a multi-million-dollar empire by allowing men like Todd Benson to dictate her place in the world. She leaned in ever so slightly, just enough to make the space between them feel smaller. "Captain Benson, let's not waste time with coded language. You don't think I look like someone who owns a private jet. Is that correct?" Todd shifted on his feet, his composure wavering. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Sophia said smoothly. The air around them crackled with unspoken tension. The check-in receptionist shifted uncomfortably in the background, pretending to focus on her screen. A few passengers in the lounge stole curious glances, sensing the silent storm brewing between them. Todd cleared his throat, visibly trying to regain control of the situation. "I was just ensuring all protocols were followed, Miss Langston." Sophia let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Let me be perfectly clear, Captain Benson. Your job is to ensure my flight gets to its destination safely, not to determine whether I belong in my own aircraft. If there's a problem, state it now." Todd hesitated. "No." Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Then I suggest you prepare for takeoff. And be sure you're fully prepared. I have no tolerance for unprofessionalism." Her words hummed between them like an unspoken challenge. Todd's jaw clenched. A muscle in his cheek ticked. But he knew he was outmatched. "Understood." He muttered stiffly before turning on his heel and walking away. Sophia exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar weight of yet another battle she hadn't asked to fight. Another moment of silent war waged against assumptions and prejudices too deeply ingrained for men like Todd Benson to even recognize. She checked her watch. The jet would be ready soon. And so, it seemed, with the battle ahead. A brewing storm. Settling into the private lounge, Sophia pulled out her tablet, but her focus remained elsewhere. Her mind replayed the interaction with Todd, analyzing every micro-expression, every hesitation in his words. She had seen men like him before. Pilots, executives, clients, men who mistook their privilege for expertise, who believed they were gatekeepers to spaces they had no right to control. Her phone vibrated on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. Leonard Hayes calling. She smirked, answering immediately. "You have impeccable timing." "Always," came Leonard's deep, warm voice. "You sound annoyed. What happened?" Sophia sighed. "Nothing new. Just another man making assumptions." A beat of silence. Then, "Do I need to handle it?" "No," Sophia replied, a steely glint in her eye. "I'll handle it." Leonard chuckled knowingly. "Then I feel sorry for him." Sophia's lips curved. "He'll learn soon enough." As she ended the call, a young flight attendant approached hesitantly, balancing a tray with coffee. "Miss Langston, would you like anything while you wait?" Sophia smiled warmly. "A coffee would be lovely." "Thank you." "Claire," the woman supplied with a shy smile. "Thank you, Claire." As Claire turned to leave, Sophia's voice stopped her. "And Claire." The attendant turned back. "If anyone ever makes you feel like you don't belong, remember, it's their ignorance, not your worth." Claire blinked, her eyes widening slightly. Then, after a pause, she smiled. A real, unguarded smile. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "Thank you." Sophia nodded, watching her walk away. The battles, she knew, would never truly end. But today, at least, she had drawn her line in the sand. And by the time this flight was over, Captain Todd Benson would learn a lesson he would never forget. A battle at 30,000 feet. Sophia settled into the plush leather seat of the private lounge, her fingers idly scrolling through the notes on her tablet. She should have been fully immersed in the final details of her Geneva meeting, but her mind refused to let go of her earlier encounter with Captain Todd Benson. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her place in a world built on wealth and privilege. She had seen doubt flicker in the eyes of investors, competitors, and even employees. The quiet underestimation, the barely concealed surprise when they realized who she was. It was a silent battle fought in boardrooms, luxury venues, and even, apparently, in the private aviation sector. But Sophia Langston was not a woman who accepted anything less than the respect she had earned. Her phone vibrated softly on the armrest. Another message from Leonard Hayes. "Leonard, you sure you don't want me to intervene?" Sophia, "Not yet, but keep your phone close." Leonard, "Always, just say the word." She set her phone down, exhaling slowly. Leonard had been her closest business ally and confidant for years. They had built their respective empires side by side, often exchanging war stories about the hurdles they'd faced as black entrepreneurs in industries that weren't designed for them. But today's battle was hers to fight. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Langston, your jet is ready for boarding." Sophia looked up to see Claire, the flight attendant from earlier. "Thank you, Claire," Sophia said, rising gracefully. As she walked toward the jet, she caught sight of Captain Benson standing near the stairway. His posture was rigid, his eyes narrowed slightly as he watched her approach. Sophia didn't falter. She climbed the steps at a steady, unhurried pace, carrying herself with the effortless poise of a woman who knew her worth. The moment she stepped into the jet's interior, she felt a familiar sense of accomplishment wash over her. This was hers. Every inch of polished wood paneling, every detail of the custom leather seating, every state-of-the-art amenity. It was all a testament to the years of relentless work she had put into building her business. Captain Benson entered behind her, his presence filling the space with a tense energy. "I assume everything is ready for takeoff?" Sophia asked coolly, not turning to look at him. Todd cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. We'll be departing shortly." Sophia turned then, her eyes locking onto his. "Good. I expect a smooth and professional flight, Captain." For a split second, something flashed in his expression. A storm of emotions, resentment, discomfort, perhaps even a flicker of regret. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and strode into the cockpit. Sophia took her seat, fastening her seatbelt as Claire approached to offer a pre-flight drink. She declined with a polite smile, choosing instead to gaze out of the window. The engines hummed softly beneath her as the jet began its taxi down the runway. She exhaled slowly. Whatever tension lingered in the air, she would deal with it soon enough. Trouble in the skies. The first hour of the flight passed smoothly. Sophia had lost herself in the pages of a report, mentally preparing for the negotiations ahead. The Geneva expansion was one of the biggest moves for her company, and she needed every detail to be perfect. But something was off. It was subtle at first. A delay in drink service, a slight turbulence that hadn't been announced. Then came the real problem. The overhead speaker crackled to life. "Miss Langston," Captain Benson's voice came through, unnervingly calm. "Could you step into the cockpit for a moment? There's something I need to discuss with you." Sophia frowned. That was highly irregular. She unbuckled her seatbelt, casting a glance at Claire, who looked just as confused as she did. With measured steps, Sophia made her way to the cockpit. The door was open just enough for her to see inside. The dim glow of flight instruments, the co-pilot sitting tensely beside Benson, eyes flicking between the controls and his superior. "Captain," she asked, stepping just inside. Todd turned in his seat, his expression unreadable. "I've been reviewing the flight documentation," he said, his voice neutral but firm. "And I need to verify some things with you." Sophia folded her arms. "Such as?" He leaned back slightly. "Ownership details. I just need to confirm that everything checks out." Her stomach tightened. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't about flight documentation. This was about him still not believing that she owned the jet she was currently flying in. She inhaled deeply, keeping her voice steady. "Are you questioning my ownership again, Captain Benson?" He hesitated. "I'm just being thorough." Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Captain, my legal ownership of this aircraft was verified long before I even set foot on this jet. If there was an issue, it would have been flagged at the terminal." Todd said nothing, but the way his fingers tapped against the armrest spoke volumes. Sophia stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only he and the co-pilot could hear. "Let me be very clear, Captain Benson," she said, her words edged with steel. "This is not your airline. You do not decide who belongs here. And if you continue this charade, I promise you, by the time we land in Geneva, your career will be in free fall." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Am I clear?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, with a tight jaw, he nodded. "Crystal he muttered. Sophia turned sharply and left the cockpit without another word. The moment she stepped back into the cabin, she pulled out her phone and sent a message. Sophia, Leonard, I need you to be ready for something. Leonard, I'm already on standby. What happened? Sophia, we might have a bigger problem than I thought. She exhaled, forcing herself to remain calm. This was not over. Not by a long shot. The breaking point. The next hour passed in silence, but Sophia could feel the tension thickening. Then, without warning, the jet lurched. The cabin lights flickered, and a sharp jolt of turbulence threw Sophia slightly forward in her seat. The intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Captain Benson's voice came through, this time with a strange edge to it. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Sophia's eyes narrowed. That didn't sound like turbulence. Claire, the flight attendant, hurried over, her face pale. Miss Langston, Before she could finish, Sophia's phone buzzed. A message from Leonard. Leonard. Sophia, I just got word from Elite Aviation. The CEO has already been notified of the situation. They're waiting to hear how this flight goes. Sophia's heart pounded. This wasn't just about a pilot with a bias. This was about a man who was losing control of his own prejudice and possibly his professionalism. If Todd Benson was willing to go this far, then this fight had just reached its breaking point. And Sophia Langston did not lose battles. She straightened in her seat. By the time they landed, justice would be served, one way or another. The descent into chaos. The jet vibrated with an unsettling force as another sharp jolt of turbulence rattled the cabin. Sophia tightened her seatbelt and shot a glance toward Claire, who stood gripping the back of a nearby seat, her knuckles white. Something was off. This wasn't the kind of turbulence she had experienced on dozens of private flights before. This felt intentional. The intercom crackled to life once more. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Benson's voice droned over the speakers. Due to some unexpected weather conditions, we will be making some adjustments to our flight path. Nothing to worry about, but for safety reasons, I'd advise all passengers to remain seated. Sophia frowned, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the small screen on the armrest that displayed the flight route. There was nothing but clear skies outside. No storm clouds, no apparent disturbances. And yet, Benson was altering their course. Something in her gut twisted. He's trying to make a statement. Claire approached her cautiously. Miss Langston, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. The co-pilot. He seems uneasy. I overheard him asking the captain if they should check in with air traffic control about the course adjustment, and the captain shut him down. He didn't even give a proper explanation. Sophia's fingers tightened around the armrest. She had been prepared for microaggressions, for doubt, for resistance. But this was dangerous. Her phone vibrated against the small table beside her. A message from Leonard. Leonard, I have some updates. Call me when you can. Sophia exhaled slowly before unlocking her phone and quickly typing a response. Sophia, I can't talk right now, but something's wrong. Todd's changing the flight path without warning. The reply came almost instantly. Leonard, that's not just wrong. That's illegal. I'll notify Elite Aviation now. If anything feels off, demand they patch you through to air traffic control yourself. Sophia didn't waste time. She unbuckled her seatbelt and rose, ignoring the uncertain look from Claire. Miss Langston, the attendant murmured, concern lacing her voice. I need to speak to the cockpit, Sophia said firmly. Right now. The confrontation. The cockpit door was locked when Sophia reached it. Of course it was. She knocked once, loud enough to be heard over the whir of the engines. No response. She knocked again, harder this time. A pause. Then the intercom buzzed. Miss Langston, please return to your seat. The cockpit is a restricted area during flight. Sophia's jaw clenched. "Captain Benson, I need a direct explanation for why we're changing course." Silence. Then, after a beat, the intercom crackled again. "As I said before, we're experiencing some unexpected weather conditions." "Bullshit," she said sharply. "There are no clouds in sight, and my flight tracker says we're veering off the original path. You do not have the authority to change flight plans mid-air without proper clearance." Todd's voice carried a slight smirk. "I'm the captain, Miss Langston. That means I make the calls for the safety of this flight." Sophia felt her blood run hot. He was doing this on purpose. A power move. A final act of defiance. And she refused to be at his mercy. She turned to Claire. "Do you have direct access to air traffic control?" The young woman hesitated. "Only through the captain's comms, but—" "Then get me a call to Elite Aviation's headquarters immediately," Sophia ordered. "This flight is about to become a legal incident." Claire's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded and hurried toward the small cabin phone. Sophia turned back to the cockpit door. She was done playing games. "You listen to me, Benson," she said, her voice razor-sharp. "If you don't return us to our original course right now, you won't just lose your job. You'll face criminal charges for endangering passengers." Still, silence. And then, finally, Todd spoke. "You don't belong here, Miss Langston," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not in this plane. Not in this world. You can buy your way in, but that doesn't make you one of us." Sophia's breath caught for half a second, but not in shock. Not in fear. In fury. She had dealt with men like Todd her entire life, but none had ever been stupid enough to put their entire career on the line just to prove a point. He wasn't just prejudiced, he was reckless. The plane jerked again, harder this time, and Sophia had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. "No, this is not happening. Miss Langston." Claire called from the small communications station near the galley. "I got through to Elite Aviation. They want to speak with you." Sophia stormed over, taking the phone from Claire's trembling hands. "This is Sophia Langston." The voice on the other end was crisp and authoritative. "Miss Langston, this is Michael Connors, CEO of Elite Aviation. I've been made aware of the situation. Can you confirm what's happening on board? Your pilot, Todd Benson, has unilaterally altered the flight path without approval. He refuses to provide justification and has locked himself in the cockpit," Sophia said, forcing herself to remain calm despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "I need immediate authorization to have this flight redirected back to its original course." A pause. Then Connors spoke again, his voice ice-cold. "I want you to put me on speaker, right outside the cockpit." Sophia did as she was told, stepping back up to the locked door and pressing the phone's speaker button. "You're live." "Captain Benson," Connors' voice boomed through the small space. "This is your direct superior. Open the door. Now." Nothing. Then the faintest rustle came through the speakers, like Todd had leaned toward the intercom inside. "Sir," he said, his voice clipped, "I was only acting in the best interest of this flight." "Bullshit," Connors snapped. "You were acting in your own interest, and you just turned your career into a crime scene. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. If you do not comply, I will personally ensure you never fly commercially or privately again." The silence was deafening. Then, a click. The cockpit door swung open. Todd's face was red, his jaw clenched so tightly Sophia thought he might break a tooth. The co-pilot, on the other hand, looked pale and shaken. "Miss Langston," Connors said sharply, "hand the phone to the co-pilot." Sophia did as she was told, stepping aside as the co-pilot took the phone with trembling hands. "Sir," he stammered. "You're in command now," Connors instructed. "Follow the original flight plan to Geneva." "Understood." "Ah, yes, sir." The co-pilot turned toward Todd, his grip tightening on the phone. "Step out of the cockpit, Captain Benson." For a moment, Sophia thought Todd might resist. His eyes burned into hers, dark with anger and something else. defeat. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed past her. Sophia didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink as he brushed past her shoulder. "You're finished, Benson," she murmured. His footsteps pounded toward the rear of the cabin. And with that, the storm was over. The plane returned to its rightful course, and Sophia Langston, against all odds, had won. The cost of defiance. The tension in the jet's cabin felt thick enough to cut with a blade. Even with the crisis technically resolved, Sophia could still feel the lingering unease in the air. Todd Benson was no longer in control of the cockpit, but his presence in the cabin was like a dark cloud looming overhead. Sophia returned to her seat, her posture as poised as ever, but her mind still sharp, still calculating. The flight was back on course to Geneva, yet something told her this ordeal wasn't over. Men like Todd didn't back down so easily. They didn't just accept defeat, they plotted their next move. She had seen it before in boardrooms, in corporate negotiations, in whispered conversations that sought to undermine her authority. This was no different. Todd had lost the battle, but was he really going to let himself lose the war? Her phone vibrated on the armrest beside her. A message from Leonard. "Leonard, just spoke with Connors. Todd is officially terminated. They're pulling his aviation license for misconduct." A slow smirk tugged at the corners of her lips. "Sophia, good. Now, tell Connors I want a written statement confirming this before we land." Leonard's reply was instant. "Leonard, already on it." Sophia exhaled through her nose, one step closer to making sure Todd Benson never tried something like this again. Not with her, not with anyone. Across the cabin, Claire moved cautiously, her eyes flickering toward Todd, who now sat stiffly near the back of the jet, his arms crossed, his face dark with barely contained rage. The co-pilot, a younger man named Ethan Wells, had done an admirable job regaining control of the flight, but even he seemed shaken by what had just transpired. Sophia caught his eye and gave him a slow nod of appreciation. He nodded back, looking slightly reassured, before disappearing back into the cockpit. As the hum of the engines filled the silence, Claire approached Sophia's seat. "Miss Langston," she said in a low voice, "are you sure you want him to remain on board?" Sophia glanced toward Todd. His fists were clenched, his breathing uneven. She could see the muscles in his jaw working as he struggled to contain whatever storm raged inside him. Would he try something else? She wouldn't put it past him. But she had already won. And now she wanted him to feel every moment of his own downfall. "He's not in control anymore," she said smoothly. "Let him sit there and stew in his own failure." Claire hesitated, then nodded, relief flickering across her face. "Understood, Mom." The breaking point. 30 minutes passed. Sophia kept her focus on her tablet, reviewing the Geneva presentation once more, but in the background, she could feel Todd's restless energy building. He was shifting in his seat, exhaling sharply, gripping the armrests as if trying to hold himself together. Then, finally, he snapped. "This is bullshit," Todd growled under his breath. The words weren't meant to be heard, but in the small, enclosed cabin, they cut through the air like a knife. Sophia didn't react at first. She continued scrolling through her presentation, as if she hadn't heard him at all. Todd shifted, turning slightly in his seat. "I did my job. I did what I thought was right. But no, you people always have to make it about race, don't you?" A deathly silence fell over the cabin. Sophia's fingers stilled on the screen. Claire's eyes went wide in horror. Even the co-pilot, who had just stepped out for a brief moment, froze near the cockpit door. Sophia finally set her tablet aside. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her gaze to Todd. "Excuse me." Todd let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "You think I don't see what's happening here? You think I don't know how this is gonna play out? You had this planned from the start. You wanted a reason to take me down." A slow, knowing smile spread across Sophia's lips. "Todd," she said smoothly, "you did that all on your own." His nostrils flared. I was protecting the integrity of this flight. Sofia tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were an insect under a magnifying glass. By questioning my ownership of my own jet. By changing the flight path without authorization. By locking yourself in the cockpit to prove some twisted point. Todd's face flushed red. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into something lower, deadlier. "Tell me, Captain Benson," she murmured. "Was it worth it?" Todd's breath came heavier now. He shook his head again, as if trying to convince himself that this wasn't really happening. "This isn't fair," he muttered, almost to himself. Sofia sat back, crossing one leg over the other. "Fair," she repeated, amusement flickering in her voice. "Let me tell you what isn't fair, Todd." Her voice remained calm, steady, but there was steel beneath every syllable. "It isn't fair that I had to work twice as hard, push twice as hard, and prove myself twice as much just to be taken seriously in a world that was built to exclude me. It isn't fair that men like you get to question my success while failing upward in your own careers. And it definitely isn't fair that you thought you could jeopardize my safety. Jeopardize this entire flight, just to soothe your own fragile ego." She leaned back, her dark eyes never leaving his. "So don't talk to me about fair." Todd's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Claire, standing nearby, looked almost stunned by the exchange. The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing just how deep the consequences of this moment were. And Todd, for the first time since the flight began, he looked small. His shoulders sagged slightly. His hands, still curled into fists, slowly relaxed. He looked away, jaw clenched so tightly she thought he might break a tooth. He had nothing left to say, nothing left to fight with. He had lost. Sofia let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel the weight of his own defeat. Then, in one smooth motion, she picked up her tablet again and resumed reviewing her presentation. The conversation was over. Todd Benson no longer existed in her world. The fall of a pilot. By the time the jet touched down in Geneva, Todd was pale, silent. He made no move to approach Sofia again. As the door opened and fresh Swiss air flooded the cabin, two men in dark suits stood waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Elite Aviation's legal team. Todd hesitated, his eyes darting toward Sofia. She didn't even glance at him. He let out a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and stepped off the plane. The men greeted him with stiff nods and immediately escorted him toward a waiting car. Sofia took her time. She descended the steps at a leisurely pace, her gaze sweeping over the Geneva skyline. The crisp air filled her lungs, and a deep satisfaction settled over her. Todd Benson was done. Her company's European expansion was about to begin. And once again, she had proven that no one, no matter how much they tried, could stop her from soaring. She climbed into the waiting car, her head held high. There was still work to do, and Sofia Langston never stopped. When the dust settles, the sleek black car glided through the pristine streets of Geneva, the city's blend of old-world elegance and modern sophistication passing in a blur beyond Sofia Langston's window. The ordeal aboard her private jet was over, or at least it should have been. Todd Benson was done. His career, his credibility, and any illusion of power he held over her had evaporated the moment he stepped off that plane. But Sofia knew better than to assume that battles like these ended just because the other side had lost. Her phone vibrated on the seat beside her. "Leonard, Benson's officially been grounded. Connors is pushing for a full revocation of his license, but you should know, he's fighting back." Sofia exhaled through her nose, rolling her neck slightly as she read the message. "Of course, he is." Sofia, define fighting back. The response was almost immediate. "Leonard, he's already running his mouth, telling anyone who'll listen that you pulled strings to get him fired, that he was set up. It's not getting traction yet, but it's only a matter of time before someone picks up the story." Sofia's fingers tapped lightly against her knee. She had anticipated some level of backlash. Men like Todd rarely took responsibility for their failures. When backed into a corner, their first instinct was always to paint themselves as victims. Fine. If Todd wanted a fight, he'd get one. But on her terms. Sophia raised her gaze to the driver. Change of plans. Before the hotel, take me to my Geneva office. The man nodded. Right away, Miss Langston. She was done reacting. It was time to take control. The narrative war begins. The Langston Lux European headquarters was nestled in a sleek high-rise overlooking Lake Geneva. The moment Sophia stepped inside, the energy in the office shifted. Conversations hushed. Employees straightened in their seats. She wasn't just the CEO. She was the force behind everything this company stood for. And today, more than ever, she needed to remind the world exactly who she was. Sophia, came a familiar voice from down the hall. Leonard Hayes strode toward her, phone in one hand, a determined look in his eyes. He was dressed in his usual effortlessly powerful style. Dark tailored suit, crisp shirt, no tie. Always polished, always ready for war. We have a problem, he said without preamble. I know, Sophia said smoothly, stepping into the glass-walled conference room. Tell me how bad. Leonard shut the door behind them, tossing his phone onto the table. Benson's talking. Not just to people in aviation circles, he's reaching out to the press. He's framing this as reverse discrimination, claiming you had a personal vendetta against him from the moment you stepped onto that plane. Sophia's eyes darkened. Predictable. Leonard continued. Elite Aviation has already released a statement confirming that his actions were unauthorized. But it won't be enough. You know how these things work. If he gets the right outlet to spin his story, it won't matter that he was objectively in the wrong. The narrative will shift. And once that happens, I lose control of the message, Sophia finished. Leonard nodded. She leaned back slightly, drumming her fingers against the table. Who has he spoken to so far? Mostly low-level aviation blogs, but someone at Business Weekly flagged that one of their reporters was contacted by an anonymous source about a high-profile discrimination case involving a private jet owner. Leonard exhaled sharply. They haven't published anything yet, but it's only a matter of time. Sophia smiled faintly. Then we give them something else to publish first. Leonard raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? She turned to the assistant standing just outside the conference room. Get me a media strategist. Now, turning the tables. 1 hour later, a full crisis response team had gathered in the conference room. Digital screens displayed news trackers, media analytics, and trending social discussions. A woman in a sleek gray blazer, Miriam Ellis, one of the best PR minds in the business, stood at the head of the table. Here's where we stand, Miriam began, clicking to the next slide. So far, Benson's claims haven't gained much traction, but that doesn't mean they won't. If a major outlet picks this up and frames it as a controversial firing, it could damage your brand, both personally and professionally. Sophia nodded, arms crossed. So we get ahead of it. Miriam's lips curved. Exactly. We need to control the first major headline that hits the media. Right now, we have 2 angles we can push. She clicked to the next slide. Option 1. The empowerment narrative. A feature story on Sophia Langston, her journey, her success, and the challenges she's overcome. The flight incident is framed as just one example of the barriers she's had to face as a black woman in elite spaces, but the focus remains on her accomplishments. Option 2. The accountability approach. An exclusive release of Elite Aviation's internal findings, highlighting Todd Benson's misconduct in past incidents. Turns out, Sophia wasn't the first person he had mistreated. He had a history of questionable behavior with minority passengers, but those incidents had never been escalated. Until now. Sophia tapped her fingers against the table. Which option does more damage? Miriam smirked. Option 2. Leonard raised an eyebrow. You got dirt on Benson. Miriam clicked again, pulling up a confidential report. Elite Aviation gave us access to his flight records. Turns out, he's had multiple passenger complaints over the years. Racially charged comments, unequal treatment of clients, even a prior altercation with a flight attendant who accused him of harassment. Sophia's eyes glinted. And yet he still had a job. Until he met you, Leonard murmured. Sophia considered for a moment, then nodded. We go with option 2. I want this documented, verified, and delivered to Business Weekly before Benson even realizes he's lost the game. Miriam smiled. Consider it done. The fall of Todd Benson. The next morning, Business Weekly broke the story. EXTLUSIV. Private jet pilot fired after history of discrimination comes to light. Industry calls for greater accountability in aviation. The article wasn't about Sophia Langston. It was about Todd Benson. His history of misconduct. The passengers who had lodged complaints against him. The flight attendants who had spoken out. Sophia was mentioned only once, in the final paragraph, as the woman who finally held him accountable. And just like that, his entire defense collapsed. Benson tried to fight back. He went on a social media rant. He tried to claim he was a victim of corporate cancel culture, but it didn't matter. The truth had already been cemented in the public eye. By the end of the week, his name was blacklisted from the private aviation industry. Sophia, on the other hand, her company's European expansion was already making headlines, a rising business empire, a billionaire CEO redefining the luxury industry. She had won, not just the battle, the entire war. And as she stood in her Geneva office, overlooking the city, Sophia Langston smiled. Because this was power. Not the kind Todd Benson had tried to hold over her. The kind that lasted. Building legacies, breaking barriers. The Geneva skyline stretched out before Sophia Langston, a masterpiece of old-world charm and cutting-edge innovation. The air, crisp and clean, carried the faint hum of a city in motion, a place where deals were struck over espresso and riverside cafes, and billion-dollar negotiations unfolded behind the glass walls of high-rise boardrooms. Sophia stood at the window of her office, fingers lightly tapping against the railing as she took in the sight. She had won. Todd Benson's name had been erased from the aviation industry. Her company's European expansion was unfolding exactly as planned. The public narrative had turned completely in her favor, but Sophia Langston never mistook a single victory for the end of the war. She turned at the sound of the office door opening. Leonard Hayes strode in, his dark suit immaculate as always, a folder tucked under his arm. Just got word from Business Weekly. Their latest piece on you is already trending. Sophia arched an eyebrow. And the headline. Leonard smirked and placed the folder on the desk. From boardrooms to private jets, Sophia Langston's unstoppable rise in the luxury industry. She let out a soft hum of approval. Leonard crossed his arms. Benson tried to fire back on social media again last night. I assume it didn't go well. Not in the slightest, he said with a chuckle. After his little rant, people started digging even deeper. Someone leaked an old recording of him making racist comments on a flight years ago. He's done. No company will touch him now. Sophia wasn't surprised. The thing about men like Benson, they never knew when to shut up. And Elite Aviation. Leonard's smirk deepened. Connors is doing damage control. He's implementing new diversity and accountability measures. Wants to meet with you personally to discuss them. Sophia considered for a moment. Good. I'll set up a meeting. But make it clear, I'm not just doing this for optics. I want to see actual policies put in place. Leonard nodded. Understood. Sophia walked to her desk, flipping open the folder Leonard had brought. Inside were reports on her company's European expansion. The real reason she was here. Because, while dismantling Todd Benson's career had been satisfying, her focus was bigger than one man's downfall. She was here to build an empire. A new chapter begins. 2 hours later, Sophia sat in a conference room inside Geneva's most exclusive luxury hotel, a space designed for the world's elite to conduct business over glasses of vintage wine and breathtaking views of the lake. Across from her sat Gerard Laurent, CEO of one of the largest luxury conglomerates in Europe. He was older, silver-haired, a man whose handshake carried the weight of empires built on old money and centuries of tradition. Sophia knew exactly what this meeting meant. Laurent's company controlled several of the most powerful luxury brands in France and Switzerland, brands that had once refused to take her company seriously. And yet, here they were. Sophia, Laurent began, his French accent precise and clipped, "You've made quite an impression in the business world these past few weeks." She smiled, sipping her espresso. "I like to think I've made an impression for years. People are just finally paying attention." Laurent chuckled. "Indeed." He leaned forward, folding his hands together. "I'll be direct. We have watched Langston Lux's rise carefully. Your brand has an appeal that many of our European counterparts are struggling to capture: modern, inclusive, global." Sophia already knew this. The luxury industry had been built on exclusivity, catering to a narrow demographic for far too long. And now, in an era where wealth was diversifying, the old brands were struggling to keep up. They needed someone like her, someone who understood the future of luxury. Laurent glanced at the papers in front of him. "Your proposal to establish Langston Lux's European headquarters in Geneva is compelling, and I won't deny that, given recent events, working with you would send a powerful message." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "You mean it would be good PR?" He didn't flinch. "Among other things." She leaned forward, matching his gaze. "If you're looking for a diversity token, Laurent, I'm not your woman." A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Surprise, maybe even respect. "That's not what I'm looking for," he admitted. "I'm looking for a business partner who understands where the industry is heading. And from what I can see, you are ahead of everyone else." Sophia let the silence stretch, measuring the weight of his words. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Then let's make history, shall we?" Laurent exhaled, shaking his head with amusement. "You don't hesitate, do you?" "Never." And just like that, the deal was sealed. The shadow that lingered. By the time Sophia returned to her hotel suite that evening, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. The day had been a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and strategic moves. The deal with Laurent's company was a game-changer. It meant access to distribution networks, retail spaces, and manufacturing hubs across Europe. It meant power. But even as she poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch, a lingering thought pressed at the back of her mind. Todd Benson. He was gone from aviation, his career ruined, his reputation destroyed. And yet, Sophia had learned long ago that men like him never truly disappeared. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Unknown. You think you won. But people like you don't belong here. Enjoy it while it lasts." Sophia stared at the screen. Then, without a second thought, she blocked the number and set the phone aside. This wasn't fear. This was predictable. The last breath of a dying breed. She exhaled slowly, taking a sip of her wine. Let them seethe. Let them watch from the sidelines as she continued to rise. Because Sophia Langston didn't just win. She built legacies. And no amount of bitterness, no whisper of resentment, no shadow of old power structures would ever be enough to stop her. The power move. The next morning, Sophia stood on the private tarmac once more. But this time, there was no tension, no doubt, no Todd Benson, only her. And her jet. Claire, the flight attendant, smiled warmly as she stepped forward. "Miss Langston, everything is ready for takeoff." Sophia nodded. "Good." As she climbed the steps, she felt the weight of the past week settle behind her. She had done more than win. She had reshaped the playing field. As the engines roared to life, Sophia settled into her seat, her gaze set on the sky ahead. The fight wasn't over. But the world was finally starting to see her for what she was. Unstoppable. And as the jet lifted into the sky, Sophia Langston did what she always did. She soared. A new altitude. The private jet cut through the skies, its sleek silver body slicing effortlessly through the crisp Swiss air. The engines hummed steadily beneath Sophia Langston as she sat in her private cabin, sipping on a perfectly poured espresso. She had done it. The deals had been signed. The partnerships had been secured. The European expansion of Langston Lux was no longer a distant goal. It was happening. But Sophia wasn't celebrating yet. Not because she didn't deserve to. She did. She had won a battle that wasn't just about her jet or a single prejudiced pilot. She had dismantled yet another barrier in a world that still tried to dictate who belonged at the top. But experience had taught her that victory is never permanent. There was always someone waiting in the wings, someone watching, plotting, hoping for her downfall. And if history had taught her anything, it was this: you don't just fight to win, you fight to keep what you've won. She exhaled, setting down her cup, and turned her attention back to the open file on her tablet. Projected revenue growth, market penetration strategies, legal assessments, every detail of her company's expansion had been mapped out to perfection. Except one thing. What comes next? A light knock at the cabin door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Langston. Claire, the flight attendant, peeked inside. Sophia glanced up. Yes. Claire hesitated for just a moment, then stepped forward, holding out a small envelope. This was left for you at the terminal before takeoff. Sophia took it, her fingers grazing over the thick, expensive cardstock. There was no name, no return address, just her initials. SL. A slow, familiar tension settled in her chest. Sophia turned it over, tearing the seal with precise movements, then unfolded the crisp paper inside. One line, typed. Anonymous. You can buy power, you can buy a jet, but you will never buy your way into this world. Sophia let out a slow breath through her nose, her expression unreadable. Todd Benson. It had to be. She had ended his career. His name was poison in the aviation industry. But people like him, people who had built their entire self-worth on exclusivity, entitlement, and control, they never truly accepted when the world moved on without them. They lashed out. Claire's voice was careful, cautious. Should I notify security? Sophia folded the note calmly, slipping it into her blazer pocket. No, she said simply. But make sure Elite Aviation is aware. If anyone else from Benson's old network tries to interfere with my flights, I want to know immediately. Claire nodded. Understood, Mom. Sophia studied the young woman for a second. You handled yourself well this past week, she said, her voice softer now. Not just as a flight attendant, but as someone who saw injustice and didn't ignore it. Claire blinked, taken aback for a moment, then straightened her shoulders. I just wanted to do the right thing. That's exactly why I want to offer you a position. Claire's mouth parted slightly. What? Sophia smiled. I'm assembling a new team. A personal aviation team. Pilots, flight attendants, ground staff. All people I can trust. No more flying with unknowns. She paused. I'd like you to be a part of it. Claire swallowed hard, her eyes wide with shock. Miss Langston. That's. Call me Sophia, she corrected smoothly. Claire let out a breath, shaking her head. Sophia, this is more than I ever expected. You don't have to decide right now, Sophia said. But think about it. Claire's lips curled into a slow, genuine smile. I don't need to think about it. My answer is yes. Sophia extended a hand. Claire shook it, her grip firm, her expression full of quiet determination. That was what Sophia respected the most, not just competence, but courage. Because in a world that still fought to keep people like them in their place, sometimes courage was the only currency that mattered. Power and its price. By the time the jet landed in New York, the night had fallen, casting the city in a web of lights. From the tarmac, the skyline stretched out before Sofia like a fortress of glass and steel, her domain. As she stepped off the plane, her personal driver, Andrew, was already waiting beside the sleek black Bentley. He opened the door for her. "Welcome home, Miss Langston." Sofia slid inside, letting the smooth leather interior envelop her. The moment the door closed, her phone buzzed. "Leonard," she answered. "Tell me it's handled." Leonard sighed. "Benson's officially gone underground. No job, no public statements, nothing." "But," Sofia's fingers tightened slightly. "But what?" "There are whispers," Leonard said carefully. "Some of the old money circles he ran in. They didn't love how things played out. And you know how these people operate. They don't attack directly. They move quietly." Sofia's gaze turned toward the skyline, her reflection staring back at her in the tinted window. "So let them move," she said coolly. Leonard chuckled. "I figured you'd say that." Sofia shifted, crossing one leg over the other. "I didn't build my empire by begging to be let in, Leonard. They either adapt or they get left behind." Leonard let out a slow breath. "And if they decide to push back?" Sofia smiled faintly. "Then I remind them exactly why I own the jet, while they're still waiting for permission to board. Legacies are not given. They are taken." The Bentley pulled up in front of her penthouse, a towering work of architecture that overlooked Manhattan like a queen surveying her kingdom. As she stepped inside, the air smelled of fresh linen and expensive perfume. The lights dimmed to a perfect, golden glow. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders. This was her space. No barriers, no assumptions, no ceilings. But she knew that peace was a luxury, not a guarantee. This wasn't just about a pilot. It wasn't just about one flight. It was about power. And power came with a price. Sofia Langston had already paid hers. And if anyone thought they could take it from her now. She smiled as she poured herself a glass of wine. "Let them try."